Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. We'll be looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times Radio expert analysis. This week, Donald Trump has been inaugurated and told Putin to end his ridiculous war. Far from it, Russia continues to take record losses in their push for the Donbas, and Putin's North Korean troops have suffered up to 40% casualties, according to Western intelligence. This week, we've heard from Bill Browder, John Herbst, and Sean Bell. And looking at each of their updates this week, Bill Browder is an interesting one because he's a specialist on the Russian economy and a specialist on Putin. And he talks about the economy and he talks about the soft underbelly of the Russian economy and how the Russian economy at the minute is suffering from high inflation, high interest rates. The Russian industries are paying heavily for this. So there isn't an easy way for Russia to get out of it economically.
If we're in a situation where we're trying to get Putin to back off, to come to the table, to stop doing what he's doing, it's not going to be because he's lost 820,000 soldiers, which is what the Ukrainians are estimating as of today. It'll be because he can't afford to anymore. And Putin has done a pretty good job up until now of pretending like the Russian economy is doing fine, but it's not. The Russian economy is suffering from really high inflation, very high interest rates. All the funding of the entire war is basically tapping out all major Russian corporations. 40% of the government budget is spent on the military, industrial complex to fight the war in Ukraine. This is not an economy that anyone could categorize as being good or robust, and so Trump is not wrong in that respect.
It's interesting also, Trump was talking in his inaugural address about, making more use of American oil and gas and drill, baby, drill. Could one of the byproducts of that be that if North America is producing more oil, the global oil price dips and that also impacts the Russian economy?
There's no question that if Trump follows through on his, making America a bigger oil exporter, that the oil price will go down. If supply goes up, then the price goes down, and if the price goes down, then who benefits? Well, Ukraine benefits, and Russia loses, and so that could be a very good thing. But I would caution anybody listening to this that this drill baby drill thing is a long-term strategy. This is not a overnight thing, and it's not going to happen tomorrow that all of a sudden the oil prices go down. This is industrial policy. Over time, people will be incentivized to invest in more oil exploration, and then that should lead to more oil discovery, and that should lead to more oil exports. But this is the kind of stuff that takes a year or two or three. It doesn't happen overnight.
So if in the meantime you wanted to ramp up the economic pressure on Putin, what else should the US government and other Western allies of Ukraine be looking at? I mean, is it clamping down again on the shadow fleet? Is it sanctions again? What more would you like to see happen?
Well, the main place in which Russia continues to be able to fund their war is with their oil exports. And so it would seem logical that we should find every way of disrupting those oil exports so that Russia doesn't get the money that they're currently getting, because without that money, they couldn't fund this war. Now, of course, the counter argument to going after Russia's oil is that Russia produces 10% of the world's oil. And so if you were to fully embargo 10% of the world's oil, then the oil price would shoot up, perhaps dramatically. And we have many governments around the world that don't want oil prices high because we're fighting with inflation. And so that's not a very easy thing to do. But there are other measures in between total embargo and doing nothing, which could be done. And so, as you mentioned, there's this shadow fleet, and the shadow fleet has basically been a fleet of really old oil tankers that have been bought by Russia or as proxies. And the purpose of this shadow fleet is to basically avoid any type of oil price caps. There's currently a oil price cap in place that says Russia can't earn more than $60 a barrel. And so if the shadow fleet is eliminated or sanctioned or curtailed, then the amount of money that Russia gets from this oil sales goes down. I've been proposing a a solution to various governments, which is to go after the Indian, Chinese, and Turkish oil refineries that are buying the Russian crude oil, and say, if you buy Russian crude oil and you refine it, we will sanction you and make it very painful for anyone to buy any refined product from you. And guess what will happen? They won't buy Russian crude oil. That oil will be floating around, and perhaps those who do buy it will be buying it at a 50% discount, which means that Russia makes less money. And so there's ways of dealing with this problem, which I think don't solve it entirely, but continue to put pressure on Putin, deprive him of some of the revenues he gets, which means it's just harder and harder for him to continue to fund the war.
Cry by Donald Trump when he came in of drill, baby, drill, is something that could affect international oil prices. And of course, if global oil prices drop, that will have a massive effect on the income that Vladimir Putin can generate from selling his oil overseas. However, that Bill Browder highlights is something that is going to take quite a number of years before it'll happen, even if America decides to increase its oil output, and it'll have wider geopolitical implications. So, from a short-term perspective or a shorter-term perspective, he goes on to try and find some other way of disrupting the Russian oil exports. Now, he also highlighted you have to remember that Russian oil counts for about 10% of the global supply, and if you completely take Russian oil out of that, that's going to have an impact on global supply issues, which will put the global oil price up. And if you do that, that'll benefit Russia because it'll get more income for what it is that's managing to get out illegally through other networks. So it's a very careful balance. And Bill goes on to describe how he thinks that you should target the shadow fleet. These are old tankers that the Russians have bought that are moving Russian crude oil around outside the sanctions that have been imposed. The sanctions that have been imposed have put a maximum price per barrel, I think it's $60 per barrel, on Russian oil being sold anywhere. The shadow fleet can take that oil and sell it at the international rates. And Bill goes on to describe as to how we should go after the Indian, Turkish and Chinese refineries and put sanctions against them who are refining this Russian oil that's coming especially from the shadow fleet and turning it into products that are being sold back to the West again, and says that that will have an impact on them. Whether Donald Trump has got the desire to do that and to impact on that, we don't know. But actually, Bill, as always, hits the nail on the head. Putin's weakest point is his economy. From a military perspective, he's not concerned about the number of troops that he can lose. He is concerned about the money that's available and the legacy that that will leave in Russia once he is moved on. I have to disagree with him here slightly from a military perspective. I don't think the Ukrainians were ready to be able to operate more M1 Abrams tanks, more rocket artillery and armoured infantry together in a way from a combined arms, that's getting all the army bits working together on the ground, and a joint perspective with a proper air support to be able to punch through the Russian defences. I think that takes a long time to prepare for. As an example, a British brigade going through a normal peacetime training cycle, so it's deliberately elongated because it's peacetime, from start to being able to carry out the all-arms version of it is a 2-year cycle. We're asking the Ukrainians to do this whilst fighting a war with new equipment in a much shorter time. And I think that would be impossible. I do think Ukraine needs more equipment and needs more equipment quickly. Ambassador John was then asked whether America should give Tomahawk cruise missiles. And that creates an interesting discussion. And he suggests that Trump may continue to supply weapons to Ukraine. Trump has been trying to bully Putin into getting to the negotiating table, but Putin, it seems, you're reading behind the lines, seems to be reluctant to do that because the conditions aren't right for him.
I don't have any doubt. Well, first, if we had given Ukraine by the spring of 2023 adequate numbers of ATACMS, the missiles that can fire 180 miles. They're not deep strikes into Russia, by the way, since they only fly 180 miles. We've given lots of them, lots of F-16s, lots of Abrams tanks, so they may have been less important. Ukraine's counteroffensive of 2023 would have been a notable success as opposed to a very, very modest success. That same package of equipment would not have the same impact today because the Russian position in Ukraine is much stronger. They now, of course, have North Korean troops fighting Ukrainians in Kursk. But I imagine there is some package of equipment that could produce a similar effect today. And I would rely on my colleagues who at one time had 4 and 3 stars on their shoulders to provide the exact kit necessary to do that. And we have to make that a priority. And the Biden team, because of Putin's constant nuclear threats, which shook them in ways that American statespeople should not be shaken, they refused to do that. At this point, again, Trump and his team have not come to the recognition that in order to be successful, they have to make sure that Ukraine is stopping further Russian gains. When they come to that conclusion, they may make the right decision and restore the package of assistance and then the weapons. But I would simply make one more point. Again, ATACMS are not, despite the way the newspapers talk about them, deep strikes into Russia, right? A country that's 9,000 miles from east to west, if you go 180 miles into it, that's not getting very deep into Russia. We have weapons we could give, which are of the same vintage as ATACMS. I mean, they go back to 80s or even late 1970s technology. We have the Tomahawks, which can fly 1,000, even 2,000 miles. If I were in charge of the policy, I would tell the Russians, if your engagement in Ukraine, if your aggression in Ukraine is still going on in 6 months, we're gonna start giving Ukraine ATACMS. I mean, not ATACMS, I mean Tomahawks. Trump may not want to go that far, but just the announcement of the resumed American military aid, including ATACMS, including F-16s, would be a thunderbolt in the Kremlin, where they're hoping that Putin is going to be able to persuade Trump to allow Russia to achieve its aims in Ukraine.
And that's a very interesting suggestion.
They're still hoping on that.
Yeah, and I mean, even though Trump is often portrayed as being less naturally sympathetic to Ukraine than Biden was, Biden did everything with a note of caution. Trump has shown himself throughout his career to be a man who is prepared to take bold decisions. So potentially Tomahawks aren't completely out of the question under the Trump administration.
Well, Trump actually shook the Russians. He surprised and shook the Russians during his first term when he acted on his red line in Syria. Right? He had said if Assad uses chemical weapons against Syrian civilians, Trump will strike hard. Assad did, and using Tomahawks, he destroyed a major portion of the Syrian Air Force. I remember I was watching very closely. The Russians were just astonished and not happy about it. And then, of course, Trump was decisive when he took out Soleimani, the head of Iranian intelligence. The Russians weren't surprised then because they had seen what happened before. But, it's worth noting that Biden, just as he was timid vis-a-vis Russian aggression in Ukraine, he was timid vis-a-vis Iranian aggression in the Middle East. And in both cases, he said, I don't want this war to escalate, not recognizing that American weakness only encourages our enemies to escalate.
Trump has threatened economic sanctions. I suspect that will be backed up very closely by more military aid into Ukraine. And the debate as to whether Tomahawk cruise missiles could be provided or other capabilities able to attack military targets inside Russia, whether that could happen or not, is an interesting one. And during Trump's campaign, everyone thought that Trump was very anti-Ukraine, and he's even tried to suggest through his campaign and in his inauguration speech that he's anti-war. We have to remember, and Ambassador John goes on to mention this, that during his last presidency, Trump carried out more air attacks with cruise missiles and other things against the Syrian Air Force whenever Bashar al-Assad was dropping chemical weapons on the Syrian people. And he carried out that very audacious attack against General Soleimani from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, assassinating him. Trump is not afraid of taking direct action. And he will not come across as weak to Putin from a military perspective. So, I think Vladimir Putin is in for an interesting time. But Ambassador John Herbst's video is well worth watching. And the third video that I'm going to highlight today is from my old colleague Sean Bell, who comments on geopolitical issues as I do around the place. And he's looking at the tactics that are in Kursk, and quite rightly highlights that we'd all expected Ukraine to go in, to hold part of the territory, and then potentially to slowly withdraw from it, sending a message to Vladimir Putin that Ukraine could take the territory, and that Ukrainians were hoping for the Russians to take some of their military capability from the east, from fighting in the Donbas, and move it round to retake Kursk. They didn't. But what attacking into Kursk has done is it's allowed the war to be brought into the front rooms of the European Russians in Moscow, in St. Petersburg and elsewhere, because Russian soil has been attacked, something that hadn't happened since the Second World War. But Sean goes on to describe how this could be something that would be useful in negotiations, should we get to that point. But when it comes to negotiations, Putin will never want to give up Crimea. And he points to the history of Crimea. And we have to remember that Crimea was only given by the Russians to Ukraine in the 1950s. It was done because it was easier for Ukraine, as part of the Soviet Union at that time, to administratively rule it and to look after it. That made sense. That's riled Putin. And now that the Soviet Union has fallen apart, Putin wants to regenerate it again. But as part of that, he wants Crimea back, effectively, and he may negotiate to that land bridge that he's got down to Crimea now as part of any negotiations, but he will want to keep Crimea and keep a land bridge.
I think what you're seeing there is a preparation for the potential negotiation with Putin. Just imagine, I don't want to oversimplify this, but Russia, when Ukraine burst into Kursk, it was the first time that Russia has been invaded since the Second World War. And hundreds of thousands of people being relocated will have spread a message of fear within Russia. That would have been deeply embarrassing for Putin, and therefore was expected that he would throw all his resources at pushing Ukraine out. In many ways, that was probably Ukraine's strategy, to ease the pressure on their front line in the Donbas, because Russia would move forces round to push them out of Kursk. Now, as it's turned out, Russia hasn't really done that. What it's done is it's kept up the momentum in the south, brought North Korean soldiers in to try and deal with the Kursk offensive. And most military analysts, including myself, thought it would be very difficult for Ukraine to hold out in Russian territory for any length of time. And therefore, they would probably do a managed withdrawal rather than die in a sort of Custer's last stand in the Kursk. In fact, they've been very effective at holding the line. Although Russia has gradually squeezed that enclave, it's significantly smaller today than it was when the Ukrainians first moved in. But the North Koreans have clearly been involved in the fight, and they're clearly paying a very high price for it. So Russia almost certainly thought that put a 10,000 North Koreans, they can clear the Ukrainians out of Kursk. They weren't able to do that. And I think what we're seeing now is that President Zelensky, if he knows that he might be coming up to some form of negotiated settlement, if he holds any land in Russia, that would be immensely powerful for him in a negotiation. Putin knows that. He almost certainly will not enter a negotiation until he's pushed Ukrainian forces out. How that will play out, it's anybody's guess at the moment. But I think we're seeing that Ukraine is not going to give up without a fight.
And you mentioned there, of course, Russia continues to push forward in the Donbas in eastern Ukraine. Is Putin going to be happy if he has to go to the table in the next few months with what he has managed to get in the Donbas? Because obviously he still hasn't seized the whole of Luhansk and Donetsk.
No, there's a couple of questions in there. One of which is that when this war started back in February 3 years ago, most analysts believe this was to take the whole of Ukraine, and that Russia thought it would be able to move in really quickly and just seize it. Clearly, that's not going to be possible and anytime soon. And Russia certainly doesn't have the military might now to take the whole of Ukraine. So if you were to look at it from a grand strategic perspective, Putin has failed. Now, if you then sort of go, okay, he then had to step back and work out, okay, what am I going to achieve? One of the, without going through a history lesson, the Crimean Peninsula, and particularly the port of Sevastopol, was incredibly important historically for Putin. And although it was owned, inverted commas, by Ukraine, it was only because it was given by Khrushchev back in the 50s to Ukraine, because it was administratively easier for that region of the former Soviet Union to run it. And one of the reasons, therefore, Putin was never going to give up Sevastopol and Crimea. When Ukraine talked about joining the EU, talked about joining NATO, Russia had to create a land bridge to Crimea to stop it getting isolated. So by creating the sort of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia land bridge, he now has guaranteed access to Crimea, both by land and by sea. So I'm not saying it's a success, but as a modified objective for what he now has always said, a special military operation, I think he'll be relatively happy with that. Of course, subject to negotiations, he will be able to sell that as a major victory to the Russian people, that he's secured the land and whatever the price, he's returned some of the Russian territory to Russia. And of course, the Russian people will not be told, and they're not being told now, of the huge numbers of casualties, the price that's being paid for all this. And history generally is written by the winners, and therefore he will write a version of history which will demonstrate this was part of Russia becoming great again. So I think there's some interesting, I think purely parochially, if Russia walks away from any form of deal with its territory and some of the sanctions lifted and a seat back at the table with the world, I can see that in the short term that will appease a lot of politicians because they want the war to be over. As a strategist, I look at that and go, that could be an absolute nightmare for us and global security, because what will North Korea take of that? What will Iran take from that? What will China take from that? There are lots of profound lessons to be learned from this. And I think we've got to be really careful that institutional short-termism, which is what our political masters tend to be very good at, might come at a huge cost.
He's suggesting that what we're looking at from a political approach from our politicians in Europe and potentially from Donald Trump, but we haven't seen enough of him yet, is what he describes as institutional short-termism in looking at what the solutions may be. The reality is it's going to be something much longer, and we have to look at things in a much longer term perspective. The conflict's not going to be one on who has taken most territory in the east, whether it's the Russians or whether the Ukrainians have taken it back. The conflict's going to be one at the operational level or the strategic level. Whose economy is hurting most, who runs out of manpower and material first. That's the operational level, and that sets the strategic level implications as to who is then going to cede what when it comes to those negotiations and what pressure can come from outside. Again, Sean hits the nail on the head completely, and another video well worth watching. We've got some fantastic footage here of General Gerasimov visiting his Russian troops, and they say it's on the front lines. As ever, what we see is Gerasimov getting into a helicopter. We see a helicopter flying over some territory that's clearly been in a war zone. We see Gerasimov getting off the helicopter, and there's clearly some damaged buildings in the background, but we don't know where it is. And that's the last time we see Gerasimov in an area where we can definitely put him close to somewhere where there's been some form of action. The rest of the time, very close-in shots, inside buildings, and we look at, inside the building, there's a big map of Ukraine on the wall. Well, if you're in a particular region, you'll have your regional map that's up there. You'll not have the overall map of Ukraine. That would suggest he's much further back, potentially inside Russia, at a higher headquarters. Again, the levels of the individuals that are in there. Giving out medals to the troops, that's what I'd expect Gerasimov to be doing. And then we see Gerasimov, or we see vehicles going back to the helicopters again, and the helicopters flying away. We don't actually see Gerasimov in the vehicles. We don't actually see Gerasimov in the helicopter with the ground in the background. So, as ever, this could be a very well put together piece of Russian propaganda aimed at the troops and aimed at morale building. But that's what Gerasimov is there to do. It seems that the issues that he's had and relationships with Putin, we haven't heard any negative comments coming out about him in recent weeks or months, and therefore that all seems to have calmed down a little bit. Let's see what happens through 2025. The other thing that we see in the video are the Russians with two types of vehicles. They've got these sort of golf buggy type vehicles, and they've got old 1950s type vans that you'd see in an old French 1950s type movie with, and we see them now with coffee machines in the back or such like. The golf carts are modern capabilities supplied by China. They're almost like mini dune buggy type things, but they've got no protection on them whatsoever. And the old vans are being used, and we've seen in other videos them being used for ammunition resupply, and I'd expect other combat supplies resupply. Those are not the standard trucks that the Russians use, and it would suggest that certainly in the area that we've seen the filming, that they're having real difficulties getting trucks. The Russians are running short of equipment. The Russians are running very short of equipment, and this could be an indication of just how dire straits they're in. But it's one video and it's early days. The other video that we've got is of the Russian spy ship that's hit the news recently, the Yanmar. The Yanmar was intercepted, as we can see in the video here, by RFA Proteus and other UK warships. This is one where John Healey said that he had authorised one of our nuclear attack submarines to surface and let the Yanmar know that it had been monitored. We can see on the ship a number of radar domes and antennas and cranes at the back. The radar domes are for scanning what is around, but there's also a lot of signals intelligence capability on there, gathering communications intelligence, gathering intelligence on the radars that are being used by the ships that are monitoring it and the aircraft that are monitoring it, so that they can look at the frequencies and identify what those capabilities would be. But more interestingly, on this Russian spy ship, it's got submersible capability. So that's what the cranes are on the back, to be able to put submersibles down and help inspect and map where our critical national infrastructure, the undersea cables that we suspect it's been monitoring. And more than suspect, I think the order for the British submarine to surface was saying, we're watching you, we know what you're doing. And it scared the Russians and they ran away off. Monitoring undersea cables, the threat to undersea cables is nothing new. It's been here for about 111 years. The British were the first to attack undersea cables as the opening gambit of the First World War. The first ever aggressive act against the Germans was to cut 4 of the 5 cables crossing the English Channel. The 5th cable went through the UK. It had been intercepted, and it led to the interception of the Zimmerman telegram that brought the Americans into the war. You'd think we should have realised that. We forgot about it after the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was Russian spy ships and spy trawlers everywhere, hoovering up as much information as they could. After the Cold War, we forgot about them. The Russians didn't forget about their spying. And we're just seeing us coming back and dealing with it again. So that's our recap of events from the week. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to put comments below, and we'll answer it on our question and answer session next week if we can. But sign up for Times Radio membership and further exclusive content. Thank you and goodbye.